Something strange happened in China, and most people in the West still don't understand it. A 70 billion Silicon Valley giant entered the world's largest ride-hailing market with unlimited venture capital, elite engineers, and the playbook that had already conquered cities from San Francisco to London. 18 months later, it surrendered. Why would a company backed by billions voluntarily retreat from a market with 1.4 billion people? Stay with me, because the real story behind Uber's defeat reveals something far bigger about how power actually works in the global tech economy. Most people think this story is simple. Uber failed in China because of government protection. But here's what mainstream analysis gets wrong. The battle between Uber and Didi wasn't just about regulation or nationalism. It was about three powerful systems that shape modern economic warfare: data density, local capital networks, and state-aligned scale. If you want to understand why a 70 billion company lost in 18 months, you have to understand those three forces. When I was in Beijing a few years ago, a venture investor told me something off the record. He said foreign tech companies entering China make the same mistake. They assume capital wins. But China's digital markets run on a different physics. Let me show you the first system: data gravity. Ride-hailing is not just a transportation business. It is a data density war. Every trip, every driver, every passenger request feeds an algorithm. The platform with the most rides learns the fastest routes, predicts demand, and reduces wait times. Here's what nobody tells you. Once a platform crosses a certain density threshold, the advantage compounds brutally. By 2015, China already had roughly 280 million smartphone ride-hailing users and more than 14 million registered drivers on various platforms. This is the part that should surprise you. Didi wasn't just competing with Uber, it was absorbing smaller Chinese rivals almost weekly. Kuaidi Dutch merged with Didi, creating a network effect that Western analysts dramatically underestimated. Think about what that means. If one platform controls the majority of drivers and passengers, wait times drop, prices fall, and riders naturally open that app first. This is the data gravity effect. Most people think Uber lost because it spent too little money. The truth is the opposite. Uber burned $2 billion in subsidies in China. I talked to drivers in Shenzhen who told me they kept 3 ride-hailing apps open at the same time. But when most passenger requests came from Didi, they gradually stopped accepting Uber rides. Here's what matters in network economies. Attention concentrates where activity already exists. Data attracts more data. And once that loop begins, it becomes incredibly hard to break. By early 2016, Didi was handling an estimated 20 million rides per day across China. Uber China managed roughly 1 million daily trips. This is not a small gap. It is a 20 times difference. Let me show you what this actually means. Algorithms trained on 20 million daily rides see patterns no smaller competitor can detect. Traffic surges, neighborhood demand, airport flows, festival spikes, weather reactions. The system becomes smarter every hour, while the weaker network falls further behind. Here's the paradox. The more Uber spent subsidizing rides, the more drivers temporarily joined its platform. But the moment those subsidies slowed, they returned to the marketplace where most riders already were. Didi understood something critical: scale first, profits later. A senior economist at Tsinghua University once told me the Chinese internet behaves less like Silicon Valley startups and more like high-speed rail systems. Once a route becomes dominant, traffic locks in. Stay with me, because this connects to something even bigger than ride-hailing. System number 1, data gravity, gave Didi momentum Uber could barely slow, but that's only the first layer. The second force operating behind the scenes was even more powerful and almost invisible to Western investors. It involved political relationships, domestic capital alliances, and a strategy that reshaped the entire battlefield. Most people never saw it happening because they were watching the app on their phones instead of the power structure behind the market. And once you see that second system, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. Let me explain next. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. If the first system was data gravity, the second system was capital alignment. And this is where the story becomes much more interesting, because the battle between Uber and Didi wasn't just about apps and drivers. It was about who controlled the financial ecosystem surrounding the platform. Let me ask you something. What happens when your competitors are also your investors? That sounds absurd in Silicon Valley logic. But in China, that exact dynamic reshaped the entire ride-hailing war. Here's what nobody tells you about Didi's strategy. Instead of fighting every rival platform, they started absorbing them into their capital structure. In February 2015, Didi merged with Dache, the ride-hailing platform backed by Alibaba. That merger alone combined two companies responsible for roughly 80% of China's ride-hailing market. Think about what that means. Suddenly, the two most powerful tech ecosystems in China, Alibaba and Tencent, were aligned behind one ride-hailing company. This is the part that should surprise you. In Silicon Valley, venture capital funds compete aggressively with each other. In China's internet economy, rivals sometimes cooperate to eliminate foreign competition. Let me show you the numbers that matter. By mid-2016, Didi had raised approximately $10.5 billion in funding. That capital didn't just come from Chinese investors. It came from Tencent, Alibaba, Apple, China Life Insurance, and multiple sovereign wealth funds. This wasn't a startup anymore. It was becoming a national tech champion. When I spoke with a transportation analyst in Shanghai, he explained something fascinating. Uber believed it was competing against a company. In reality, it was competing against an ecosystem, and ecosystems are much harder to defeat. Here's what matters. The moment Alibaba and Tencent aligned behind Didi, the battlefield shifted dramatically. Alibaba controlled Alipay, the dominant mobile payments platform used by hundreds of millions of Chinese consumers. Tencent controlled WeChat, the messaging super app with over 762 million monthly users at the time. Imagine opening your messaging app and seeing a button that instantly calls a Didi ride. No extra download, no new account, no friction. That is distribution power most Western platforms underestimate. Most people think Uber lost because it didn't understand Chinese culture. But here's what's really happening. Uber was fighting a network of companies whose combined reach touched almost every smartphone in the country. And this is where the subsidies escalated into something extraordinary. By early 2016, both companies were burning cash at a historic rate. Uber reportedly spent nearly $1 billion every year in China just on driver and passenger incentives. Didi was matching those subsidies ride for ride. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute. But first, consider the scale of the battlefield. China was generating roughly 11 million ride-hailing orders per day during this period. Winning that market wasn't just about taxis. It was about controlling the future of urban mobility. A senior venture capitalist told me something revealing. He said Uber assumed capital efficiency mattered. Didi understood something else. Political alignment matters more. Here's the uncomfortable math. Every time Uber raised money for its China operation, Didi could raise even more from investors who had no interest in seeing a foreign platform dominate a critical domestic industry. This is the capital paradox. The more Uber spent, the stronger Didi's funding coalition became. And eventually, even Silicon Valley started to recognize the imbalance. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. In early 2016, rumors started circulating inside the venture community that Uber's China operation had already burned through more than $2 billion. But Didi wasn't slowing down. In fact, they were expanding into new services: private cars, taxis, buses, even test programs for autonomous driving. Let me show you what this actually means. Didi wasn't just defending the ride-hailing market. They were building a transportation platform designed to dominate the next decade. And that leads directly to the third system that sealed Uber's fate. Because even with data gravity and capital alignment, the final advantage came from something far more powerful, something most Western analysts completely underestimated. It involved regulatory timing, national strategy, and a quiet shift in policy that turned a brutal startup competition into something resembling economic statecraft. And once that third force came into play, Uber's position in China went from difficult to impossible. Let me explain why. So here's the third system, and it's the one that ultimately crushed Uber in China. Regulatory alignment fused with strategic state support. If data gravity and capital networks gave Didi momentum, this third system ensured the battlefield itself was tilted. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people refuse to confront. Foreign tech giants rarely lose to market forces alone. They lose when local systems are synchronized in ways they can't replicate. Let's start with some numbers. Between 2015 and 2016, China introduced roughly 17 municipal-level ride-hailing regulations, each slightly different, each favoring platforms with established local partnerships. Uber China, despite burning $2 billion, could not react quickly enough. Didi, on the other hand, already had deep relationships with city governments through both direct partnerships and affiliated transport companies. This is the part that should terrify investors. Government alignment multiplies market power far beyond any subsidies or marketing spend. Here's what matters. It's not just about getting a license to operate. It's about controlling access to driver data, operating permits, and even fare-setting flexibility. Uber's Western approach assumes that data and capital alone win markets. But in China, the rules themselves become a weapon. A senior economist at Peking University explained to me that the ride-hailing sector is a testing ground for how digital platforms and local governance co-evolve. In other words, every regulation was not just a rule, it was leverage. Most people think Didi's victory was inevitable because it was bigger. But the uncomfortable truth is the opposite. The market was malleable, and Uber underestimated the speed at which policy could favor domestic players. Let me show you what this actually means. Didi wasn't just executing better algorithms or paying higher subsidies. It was operating inside a system designed to accelerate winners who aligned with state objectives. Consider the case of driver permits in Shanghai. Uber drivers, no matter how many subsidies they received, were often delayed by permit reviews that Didi could expedite through its local partnerships. This created subtle but cumulative advantages: faster onboarding, fewer legal hurdles, more rides per day. Multiply that across dozens of cities, and you start to see how a $70 billion company could hemorrhage cash while struggling to grow. Here's a paradox. The very system Uber thought was neutral, China's regulatory environment, was actually the ultimate accelerator for its competitor. And this is where the numbers get shocking. By mid-2016, Didi controlled roughly 87% of China's ride-hailing market, up from 60% just a year earlier. Uber's market share never climbed above 10%. This is 87%, not around 85% or most of the market. Precision matters because the gap reflects a near-total structural advantage. Let me show you why scale, capital, and regulation alone weren't enough individually. It's their interaction that matters. When data gravity, aligned capital, and regulatory favor converge, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Uber could pour money, optimize algorithms, and launch aggressive promotions, but every move triggered a counter-reaction embedded in the local ecosystem. If you think this was just a ride-hailing story, think again. It's a blueprint for how domestic champions in China outmaneuver global giants across sectors, from fintech to e-commerce to AI. And here's what nobody tells you. This is not anti-competition rhetoric. It's simply the natural result of three synchronized systems working together. This connects to something even bigger. Didi's dominance wasn't just a business victory. It was a demonstration of systemic resilience. When I visited Beijing last year and spoke to transportation policy experts, they confirmed foreign platforms that fail to internalize all three systems, data, capital, regulatory alignment, face structural disadvantages that no amount of funding can fix. So, what happens when a company encounters all three forces simultaneously? Loss becomes inevitable, not because of poor strategy alone, but because the battlefield itself favors the local champion. This is why Uber didn't just slow down, it retreated completely. In 2016, Uber sold its China operations to Didi in exchange for a 17.7% stake in the company. That's right. After 18 months and $2 billion in losses, the $70 billion giant exited, leaving Didi with near total control. Stay with me, because in the next part, we're going to pull all of this together into a framework that explains not only Uber versus Didi, but the rules of global tech competition today. You'll see why these three systems, data gravity, capital alignment, and regulatory integration, define who wins, who loses, and how entire industries are reshaped. And then we'll explore three possible futures that will shock anyone still betting only on money and algorithms. The lesson is clear. If you think tech success is just about innovation, think again. Systems matter more than ideas, and the Uber disaster in China is the ultimate case study. Let me pull this together. What we've seen with Uber and Didi isn't just a business story. It's a blueprint for understanding how power is actually exercised in China's digital economy. I've laid out three systems. First, data gravity. Second, aligned capital networks. And third, regulatory integration. Alone, each system is powerful. Combined, they create a force multiplier that no foreign entrant, no matter how well-funded, can easily overcome. Think about it. Data gravity gave Didi an insurmountable algorithmic advantage. Aligned capital gave it financial resilience and access to the entire domestic ecosystem. Regulatory alignment ensured the rules of the game favored the local player. When I was in Shenzhen talking to engineers, they described Didi's system as a self-correcting machine that anticipates market shifts before they happen. And that's exactly what happened to Uber. Let me give this framework a name so you can remember it. I call it the triad of market domination. Triad, because it requires three interlocking forces to create an unstoppable advantage: algorithmic density, domestic capital alignment, and strategic regulatory integration. This is the model that explains why a $70 billion Silicon Valley giant lost in just 18 months. And if you want to understand global tech competition in the next decade, this is the lens you need. Now, let's examine three possible scenarios for the future, because this framework doesn't just explain the past, it predicts what comes next. Scenario 1. Western tech companies try the same approach they used in China, pouring billions into subsidies to chase market share. History suggests this will fail unless they also build local capital and regulatory relationships, which is incredibly difficult in markets with strong national ecosystems. Scenario 2. Foreign companies pivot to partnerships rather than direct competition. Look at Uber's eventual deal with Didi. By taking a stake in the local leader, they avoid the high-cost war but still gain exposure. This approach may become the default strategy for any foreign tech giant entering markets with strong domestic champions. It's a compromise, but a necessary one if you want to survive. Scenario 3 is the most interesting and the one most analysts overlook. Domestic champions, having learned from the Didi playbook, will begin exporting this model to other emerging markets. We've already seen signals in Southeast Asia and India, where ride-hailing platforms are forming alliances with local investors and leveraging regulatory influence to create dominant networks. The lesson is clear. What works in China may become a global template. Here's what matters. If you're investing, building strategy, or just trying to understand how technology and power interact, these three forces are what you should study, not just which app has the best interface or the flashiest subsidies. Most people focus on products. The real game is the system behind them. And here's a final uncomfortable truth. This isn't unique to ride-hailing. The same patterns are emerging in fintech, e-commerce, cloud computing, and AI. Companies that fail to internalize the triad of market domination risk not just losing market share, they risk total exit. Uber was lucky in that it converted losses into equity. Others may not be so fortunate. If you've been following this breakdown and found it valuable, hit that like button. Comment below. Which global market do you think is most likely to see a Didi-style disruption next? I'm curious which regions you think are ripe for this systemic dominance. To sum up, the Uber disaster in China teaches us three lessons. First, never underestimate data gravity, the compounding advantage of scale. Second, capital alignment is as important as the algorithm itself. Third, regulatory integration can turn an already strong competitor into an almost invincible force. Combine these and you don't just compete, you dominate. The triad of market domination explains the past, illuminates the present, and warns about the future. Companies, investors, and policymakers need to understand this if they want to survive and thrive in a world where systems, not ideas alone, determine the outcome. So, as you think about global tech and the next frontier, remember this. It's rarely the smartest idea or the deepest pockets that win. It's the company that understands and navigates the systems others don't even see. Uber learned this the hard way. Didi built the system and walked away the winner. And the next 18 months or 18 years will tell us who applies the triad next. If you want to see more deep dives like this on global tech power and economic shifts, subscribe, hit the bell, and join the discussion. The next story we unpack might just change how you see the global balance of innovation, money, and strategy.